Our first session is going to focus on a subject close to many of our attendees. Our longtime supporter and friend, Colonel Mark Reade from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, has assembled a panel of some of the nation's foremost experts on U.S. national security, and today they are here to give us their perspectives on how environmental security impacts our national security. Mark?
Well, thanks, John, and big thanks to the AGS team who put this together. It's really great. I've got several of my colleagues here from West Point, and we always feel so welcome here, and it's always just a great event. So always great to come down the river a little bit. Even on a morning like this morning, pretty raw out there. I think fall has finally arrived in New York. And we do need the rain, so I'm not going to complain about it, but I did Uber this morning instead of walk, so confession there. This morning's first panel really is a nice follow-on to several of yesterday's talks, specifically the first session yesterday moderated by Alec Murphy, and then also Vice Admiral Whitworth's talk. I think you'll see some of the threads that connect there. We're going to discuss what we call environmental security through the lens of U.S. national security. All of our panelists this morning are affiliated with the Department of Defense, and we all are what I would call either educators or practitioners in the area of environmental security. None of the three to my right are classically trained geographers, but I've worked with each of them long enough to know that they think like geographers, and all of them deal in the realm of environment and society, which of course is one of our discipline's major themes. I'm going to take a moment to just briefly introduce our three panelists, and then we'll jump right in. And we will save some time at the end for questions, so please, as you think of things, be prepared to ask questions at the end. We'd love to have that. So Michele Devlin is a professor of environmental security at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She's a doctor of public health, a registered nurse, an emergency medical technician. Michele's specialty areas include the circumpolar human terrain of the North, environmental gray zone warfare activities, climate migrants, civil military responses to disasters, indigenous populations, and cross-cultural engagement with diverse and underserved populations. Nick Parker is an environmental security policy advisor and member of the climate security analysis team at Pacific Northwest National Labs, one of our national labs, where he works to integrate climate modeling with human impacts. Prior to joining the lab, Nick spent over a decade on strategic forecasting efforts for the intelligence community and the U.S. Army. Nick has studied topics that include climate and food security, water and livelihood conflict dynamics, decarbonization and energy transition, political instability and social unrest, and wildlife trafficking. And finally, Matt Thorburn's career has focused on environmental management in public agencies. Matt began work with the U.S. Army in 2018, and he currently manages a program for strategic risk in the Strategic Risk Branch of the U.S. Africa Command, based in Stuttgart, Germany. He served as the first director for environmental security with the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army prior to this position he's in now, and helped lead the Army's climate change response. His previous federal employments include positions at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, quick disclaimer here. Each of us is either a federal employee or in Nick's case, works for one of our national labs affiliated with the federal government. But the discussions this morning, really this discussion represents our own perspectives and not necessarily any official position of our respective organizations. So with that, let's get going. I'm going to open with the first question, which I think Nick's going to take on. And that is really, what do we mean by environmental security? Nick, over to you.
Great. Thanks for having us, first time here, so really happy to meet you all. We'll have a slide up there, I don't know if it is, but environmental security. Matt and I actually, for quite a while, did a bit of a survey across the interagency to try to figure out what people were doing on environmental security. In the end, we've kind of coalesced around a high-level conceptual definition for environmental security. I think it is a great starting point to sort of facilitate collaboration, maybe even in the end, foster some policy coherence. We are, as Mark mentioned, very applied science and practitioner focused, so this definition is sort of reflective of that. And I think it's helpful to consider environmental security from a couple of different dimensions. One, that it's a state or condition of the physical environment that supports human and national security. And more important to us, I think, it's the practice of actively identifying, anticipating, and managing environmental risks and opportunities to promote human security and national security. So that's pretty high level. For us, I think things get really interesting once you start trying to define what you might mean by human and national security. I think all of us carry around somewhere long lists of, say, first and second order environmental stressors, whether we're talking heat, precipitation, sea ice retreat, erosion, habitat change, changes to ocean chemistry, wildfire, and then moving over into what you might consider more proximate human impacts, changes to food and water security, impacts to sectors, think like changes to manufacturing or agricultural production, and then just generally changes to human well-being, health and well-being. And then keep going to the right, what you might consider more indirect effects on what we consider national security related outcomes. So the big ticket items like social discohesion and political instability and conflict and migration and humanitarian crises. And then even this consideration of potential policy opportunities. What kind of leverage points can we see amidst all these different permutations of these factors, and how they align with your organizational goals? So in many respects, I think this task of defining environmental security comes down to repeated, deep conversations with who might be considered the ultimate end users of environmental security information and tools. So it's engaging with sponsors and policymakers across the interagency, across the stakeholder network. That's a lot of what we do. And I don't speak for the Army, but for the Army, for example, I've been able to work with the Army for many years, and so get a good feel for what the Army cares about in this realm. Army cares about, again, at a high level, they care about safeguarding human health and well-being and enhancing an ecological integrity and meeting their statutory responsibilities around environmental stewardship and cleanup, all of that, investing in resilient infrastructure, making sure that operations are adaptive, and doing a whole lot of strategic foresight analysis to try to get ahead of how environmental factors may impact what the Army considers the future operational environment. So that's one example, and many more.
Michele or Matt, anything that you would add to that?
Thank you, and thank you so much for having us, and it's wonderful to be here, especially with the three of you. We actually have worked together for a number of years now on these issues, and we've been trying to think, too, how do you actually frame environmental security and get folks to understand it? And it's very much what Nick was talking about. To us, environmental security is this big umbrella with many different subsets of areas where we're really seeing impacts to national security. Sometimes environmental security the term gets used interchangeably with climate security. We actually feel that climate security is one element of the broader umbrella of environmental security. It's obviously incredibly important, but there are so many other areas of national and global security that are impacted from an environmental standpoint, as Nick talked about things like climate migration, environmental crimes, the weaponization of environmental insecurity, environmental intelligence, a lot of these topics. So it's a very broad field. It's really multidisciplinary. I love working with our big students, our old students at the Army War College. They are people often in their 40s and 50s. And it's open really to anyone with, from any type of background, because it is so multidisciplinary. And I think traditionally, a lot of times the military maybe has focused from an environmental security standpoint, primarily maybe on infrastructure damage, hurricanes, large storms, things like that. But again, it's so much broader than that. And we also tend to be very active looking at it from a social science standpoint as well.
Very good. So I have the benefit of working with a lot of very busy general officers, and their patience with academic definitions runs a little short sometimes. So often how I couch it is just that there's a two-part test for what we're talking about here. One is it an environmental factor? And second, does it affect national security interests? And with that, it's usually a good launch to the conversation. But it's important for us as practitioners to have thought it through at this level of detail, because it gives us a framework to hang a lot of other ideas and responses on it. I think also the utility of this approach is that by casting a broad net around the concept, we bring in a broad community of practice. And oftentimes it's the same networks of people that are working on this issue or that. And by being inclusive and integrative, from the jump, we're just able to catch that whole population and use it to good effect and integrate across the different organizations.
Great, thanks. I think that's a great setup to make sure everyone understands a little bit about what we mean by environmental security. So now let's shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to ask you, how are you incorporating, studying, or leveraging environmental security in the work that you do? And Michele, let's start with you at the War College.
Sure. So at the Army War College, we're located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, not too far away from Gettysburg, and we train the top Army colonels, usually for brigade command. It's very international. We have a number of international fellows there, general officers. It's a fascinating and wonderful place to work. And the people that come there, these senior military leaders, they're already coming in with multiple degrees, are very well educated, and it takes them to the next level of strategic, long-range thinking. What are we looking at 20 years, 50 years, 100 years down the road in a number of cases? And so we recently have been able to, thanks to the assistance from a number of folks up here, been able to implement a new area of concentration in environmental security for our students there. They can also earn a recognition by the Pentagon, basically a skill identifier. We're working on finishing that up, but a skill identifier in environmental security, which would be new to them. And we have an entire team now of students who are completing their graduation research projects on environmental security issues, because they have to write a significant paper in order to graduate. And so they are part of our Environmental Security Scholars Program. We have about 30 of them. It turned out to be more popular than what we were expecting. They are students that come from all over the world. Many are American colonels, but also international colonels as well. And they're completing sponsored research projects. So we have a number of different agencies. Some are part of the Department of Defense, others are not, but they're very interested in having these students work with them on strategic research questions that they're looking into. So we have groups like NASA, the USGS, as an example, and many others who are also sponsoring research questions with us, in addition to groups like NATO, as you would expect, AFRICOM, and other Department of Defense units. And the projects that they're working on range anywhere from looking at extreme waves in the Pacific atolls and the damage that can bring and does to American military bases out there like Kwajalein, to looking at the Arctic and even Antarctica, how they are changing very significantly as they do warm, as they thaw, and new resources are being exposed like oil, gas, minerals, fisheries in future years and future decades. We see a lot more geopolitical interest now in these extreme remote regions as they change, and that of course, then by default becomes a national security and global security topic. So it's been a real joy to work with these colonels on these different projects, and including some senior civilians as well. It's been a true honor, and they're very excited about it. And again, when they graduate, it helps continue this cadre and this ongoing team of people looking long range into these environmental challenges and what we need to be aware of globally.
Great. I fell behind on your slides there.
Oh, that's
Michele,
okay. Yeah,
sorry.
and basically it's what I told you. There are
yeah.
a few photos there actually for you. That top one actually, I lived up there. That's northern Alaska, Barrow, Utqiagvik, Alaska. You can see it's right up on the edge of the shore there in the Arctic Ocean. A lot of significant damage. One of the issues we worry about in the Arctic is infrastructure damage, permafrost thawing, right? And a lot of buildings now are sinking. What does that do to military bases, to communities, to indigenous groups that may live in these remote areas and need to relocate? And again, that's some of our partners down in Antarctica, where we have a significant environmental security focus as well. Thank you.
All right, Nick.
Great. Yeah, like I said, or Michele said, big umbrella, environmental security, and a lot's happening at the labs, including a lot on the decarbonization side of things, renewable energy, all that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've been working on over the last couple of years. In coordination, very close and repeated dialogue with end users and national security world, we're focusing a lot on decision support tools for environmental security practice, and that means a lot of different things. I tend to think about our efforts as, I don't know if the stool is the right analogy, but there are kind of three big efforts here. One is integrated modeling, so lots of earth science modeling, earth systems modeling at the labs and elsewhere. So physical to physical, that's one big thing. So think climate modeling into the hydro modeling or power systems modeling or agricultural modeling. And then we have physical to social. And so you can imagine, and I've experienced this quite a bit, and it's never to be underestimated, this sort of cultural chasms between disciplines, especially when you're bridging between physical and social. We're talking sort of, cultural perspectives, research perspectives, different lexicons. So just overcoming that is a big challenge and a really interesting coordination problem. Harmonizing data, obviously, big issue there. Dealing with problems, maybe temporal and spatial mismatch of data, this idea of lags between physical stressors and social outcomes, all very problematic, all very interesting. That's one piece of it. Another piece, and it's really central to a lot of the work we're doing, is what we call kind of operationalizing social sciences. I am a social scientist by training. I don't call myself a political scientist, but that's where a lot of my work has been in the past. But I have a lot of respect for geography and anthropology and sociology, psychology to a certain extent. There's a ton of work out there across thousands of journals. It's a very siloed world. And just by nature of the incentives in the academic world, I think a lot of scholarship is on narrow slices of bigger problems. And so part of our job is to help users, analysts, operators, whoever it may be, identify the right kind of scholarship, how to make sense of it, how to bring it into decision support tools so they can responsibly walk through potential scenarios, for example, or indicator and warnings tools. So yeah, how do we get the right information on, say, social mobilization from the psychology community when it comes to motive formation, to the political science community when it comes to institutions, from the geography community when it comes to this spatial variability and vulnerability. All this stuff matters, and it's out there spread pretty diffusely, and we're trying to figure out ways of bringing it to users in an efficient and responsible manner, and then piecing the puzzle pieces together. And then the last one is this bridge to policy, which I've kind of mentioned, but earlier and right now, we're constantly talking with end users about what they think is the best uses of our time and how we can build decision support tools to help them from a strategic level all the way down to a tactical level. And so those are different crowds oftentimes, but it's just a big effort in strategic communications and coordinating on research priorities. We are tackling big themes, social mobilization, political instability, adaptive natural resource governance and illegal resource use, including fisheries, human migration and social cohesion, sort of second order effects of migration, especially mass migration. this idea of legitimacy among non-state armed groups and contested authority. Really interesting field of study. And then conflict dynamics, obviously, which we heard a lot about yesterday, and we may be leaning into the health field as well in the future. Again, really, really hyper-focused on decision support tools. And this is, I think, a really important discussion because oftentimes when you approach colleagues across the interagency, for example, and you say, we're doing climate security work or environmental security work, if you are predisposed to think that that is generally in an indicators and warnings context, like it is vulnerability indexing, then the conversations can kind of go off the rails immediately because in fact, no, we're doing that, but we're also doing this. So being very clear about what kind of decision support tools are out there or possible has been part of our efforts over the last year and a half, kind of socializing that, organizing and socializing that, that set of decision support tools. So we're doing a ton on data, finding data, organizing data, making it usable to different users, making sure it kind of coheres with their existing data systems and software. Vulnerability indexing is something we continue to do, kind of push the leading edge of vulnerability indexing. There's a ton of work on that out there, but we're trying to use the best practices in vulnerability indexing and adding some tailorability to that based on policy interests, intervention interests. Damage propagation through physical systems and social systems. This idea of measuring human well-being often being a key mediating variable between physical stresses and those second-order social outcomes you care about. Can you measure? It's a giant field of research, very diverse depending on where you sit. Really hard to get the right kind of data you need to monitor well-being in real time. And then this last one, which is somewhere where I've spent a lot of time, this idea of strategic foresight analysis. Can we bring to the fore good theory on social dynamics so that you can construct rigorous scenarios about how the world may unfold under certain contexts, in certain contexts. And so, again, think of all this stuff in the context of like, I work with UX, UI people, which is really interesting. I've never worked with computer engineers and software engineers to take a lot of this stuff and make it usable for practitioners. So that's what we're working on, and it's really, really interesting, and I encourage anyone out there who's interested in what the labs are doing just to pop on the website. There's tons of information out there across all the labs.
Great, thanks, Nick. Matt, over to you. Let's head to AFRICOM.
Yes, thanks, Colonel. So we're the consumers of this scholarship in science, and we walk it over in the area of decision support. I'll just direct your attention to the upper left there on the screen. Where this gets expressed initially is in national security documents and strategies. And that cascades down to the combatant commands and other organizations like the services. And so we're interpreting these higher level national security strategies and formulating a response inside our own organizations. Most recent example would be the services response to climate change directives. And what we saw there was them all developing independent strategies of their own take on it, but collectively they looked very closely at infrastructure resilience, their acquisitions, are they doing green purchasing or doing things that have secondary benefits like that. Logistics was a big focal area simply because those long logistics chains can have a lot of disruptions, and the way you move material and personnel around is very dependent on environmental factors. And then we're also seeing these ideas emerging in doctrine and training, and so that's sort of circling the effort back into the professional military education programs to make sure that we've got a full circle there of how we think about it and how we act on it. And that was really the services area. For the combatant commands, we're very interested on more operational end of things, such as understanding the current and future conditions and what are the security implications of those. And so we turn to the intelligence agencies, of course, but also the scholarship like we've been hearing over the last day at this conference. It helps shape our focus and investments. Then also what we've really tried to do is not have these be just sort of standalone efforts inside the organization where there's this team over here that does environmental security, but rather embed the ideas in existing strategies, policies, and organizations so that it's not really this severable concept, but it's something that's integrated and more familiar inside the current organizational approaches. And then finally, this problem set is inherently an interdisciplinary and interagency. You've heard yesterday from Department of State, USAID, et cetera. There's just a lot of US government interagency partners that have to come together. Another key piece that's being added increasingly into this mix is folks like the US Forest Service and US Fish and Wildlife. And they offer a very important lens into natural resource management and how that can help with partner resilience. And then finally, and most key for AFRICOM in particular, is the interest of partner nations and support to their own efforts toward increasing resilience and management of their natural resources. AFRICOM very much leans into the idea that this is a partner-led and US-enabled effort. And so we're not there being directive. What we're listening to is a demand signal from partners on the continent and trying to come in and support that and offer expertise or data or whatever their need is to help them be successful. So that's really how we're getting into the incorporation and leveraging these ideas to pretty good effect. Colonel?
All right, thanks for that overview, and I think, Matt, maybe this next question you could start, because I think you're kind of keyed up for it there, but really, if I had asked each of you an example of an environmental security-related challenge for the Department of Defense or the nation as a whole that, as it relates to national security, and what, if anything, is your command or your organization doing to address it? Or you could take it in a different direction. Maybe it's something maybe that we're not addressing, an environmental security challenge that we're not addressing, but you think we should be. So, Matt, maybe, again,
Sure.
I think you're keyed up for that,
Okay.
so why don't you take that one first?
So one of the tricks to this is that we work in what have been traditionally reductive hierarchical organizations. Defense has chains of command and hierarchies there that are there for good reason and work to good effect in certain situations, but they're a little bit clunky when you start to think about integrative ideas and these sort of matrixed problems that touch a lot of different spaces. So that's one of the things that we've had to revisit is just thinking about how we think. And so we've leaned more into systems thinking and interdisciplinary work there, and that's been helpful. Another thing that we've been grappling with is the idea of the scope and complexity of these issues, which requires us to think about a lot of factors that haven't traditionally been part of the mix, but also think about different spatial scales and different temporal scales. And by stretching our brains a little bit in these different directions, we've been able to cast a wider loop around the whole idea. And that's also been helpful as a framing approach. And then finally, one of the constant challenges is to coordinate this across different agencies. We all tend to drift back into our silos, whether from a disciplinary standpoint or from an organizational standpoint, and keeping those networks and those bridges built and open and functional and useful has been just a constant investment, but it's one certainly worth making. So those are the ones that we're actively chasing. Sounds a little esoteric, but there's a real high ROI in just changing the mindset of how we approach this space. In terms of areas that could use more attention from our community and this community here, I think the illicit, illegal, unregulated, and unreported commodity removals and exploitation that we're seeing globally, but particularly in Africa, is an area of growing interest. And we've seen some legislation emerge surrounding IUU fishing, and that's been helpful from a maritime security standpoint, but we're also going to be growing into the areas of logging, mining, wildlife trafficking. Because oftentimes these are driven by transnational criminal organizations or violent extremist organizations as a financing tool. And so we, as a security organization, are very keen on getting into that. And so I think that's an area of growth for us. And I'll just leave it there so we have time for the others.
Sure. Thanks. Michele or Nick?
There are many areas, I think, again, that are really fascinating to look at from a national and global security perspective that I think we need to be studying more. One of them that I'm very active in is looking at human migration. And as I tell our students, our physical terrain is changing, so is our human terrain. And we're seeing, for example, climate serving not just as a push factor, sending people away from certain parts of the world where they live and going into other areas, but as a pull factor as well, drawing human populations into areas that they've not really been in large scale in previous decades or centuries. And again, the examples of the Arctic and Antarctica, even I was in Antarctica last year, and again, it's got over 120,000 tourists now. You have 5,000 scientists work there and live there year round, or at least part of the year anyway, 1,000 year round. But it's fascinating to see that. And then looking at what, the popular, I think sort of the general term would be climate refugees, but they're actually environmentally displaced persons. These populations can have a significant impact socially on what's going on within an area of operations, right, for security forces, and these populations change. I was recently, twice actually, in the past few weeks or so along the southern border of the U.S. looking at migration period, causes of migration, and in general what we're seeing is climate has become a migration amplifier. It may not yet be the sole or single source or reason why people may be leaving an area, but it's a factor for a number of folks. You can think of, let's say, rural peasants that maybe they are moving, needing a better economy, better economic opportunities, but when you ask them more about why, what's causing those issues, they may tell you, well, we're experiencing more droughts, more flooding, more mold and mildew on our crops and these types of things. And typically what we see with climate migration, people around the world are moving more than they have been as the environment changes. They tend to move within their own borders. We're not yet seeing mass movement outside of their borders, but just within their areas. We even, within the US, we have areas of the country that are hit frequently by disasters. People now are saying, well, maybe we need to go move and live in a different area with, where we don't have as many floods or hurricanes or wildfires or things like that. But, we're always interested in that from a global security perspective. What are the demographics within a country, within a province, within a state? How are they changing? How are they in flux? And what does that mean from a defense and security standpoint globally?
Great. Nick, I don't know if you want to add or give an example, or we can...
Sure, I'll just make one quick note. I've been thinking... those interested in conflict in general often talk about the cooperation, competition, conflict spectrum. I like to plonk on top of that this idea of there's a constellation of actors out there, and we need to understand how these actors are affecting that environment, each other, how they interact with each other, et cetera. I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space for a couple to focus in on a couple of those actors, or actor categories. One is, we've mentioned already, is non-state armed groups. Those might comprise, insurgents, militias, TCOs, as Matt mentioned, BEOs. I think there is a lot of opportunity to further integrate environmental considerations into the field of microdynamics of civil war. It's a subfield that gained a lot of popularity in the teens. This idea of how environmental factors affect different behaviors of these groups, like mobilization and legitimacy and popular support, how they organize themselves, how they strategize, how they conduct operations, tactical considerations, use of violence. I think that's just a really, really interesting space right now, and it's going to be increasingly important moving forward. On the other side, we have state actors. In this interesting idea, I think, of how environmental crises may provide strategic opportunities, windows of opportunities for what we might consider peer or near-peer competitors to gain bigger footholds in certain places around the world, both militarily and from an intelligence perspective. So anyways, this idea that these crises can indirectly lead to strategic advantage for some of our competitors. So yeah, I just wanted to mention those two. I think there's lots of opportunity there, and I think we're going to be working on that over the next few years.
Great, thanks. Before we transition to questions here in just a minute, so get your questions ready. I I wonder if any one of you could share perhaps maybe a specific story or case study sounds a little dry, so I'll say story, environmental security study related story that exemplifies or highlights the importance of environmental security from a U.S. national security perspective.
I can share one. It's actually one that we are looking at currently with some of our students. So again, this is a real thing. These are, the kinds of phone calls I take every day or emails I get or requests for assistance. But as an example, we're now involved in a project looking at the country of Mongolia, so North Asia. And for those of you who may not be aware, Mongolia is an ally of the United States. We do partner with them militarily in protection of that part of the world. They train with us here. They come up to Alaska. They do winter training. We learn from them. They're good allies and good partners. But in recent years, they have been experiencing what's called a ZUD, D-Z-U-D. You can actually Google it and look it up. They've been occurring for a long time in that part of the world, but basically it's a polar vortex, right? And now that we have the jet stream is wobbling more, we have more of these polar vortices dropping down into countries like Mongolia. And what they might have, they used to get them maybe once every 10 years or so. They've now had these extreme polar vortices that can last weeks, even months in winter. And they've had them now, I think, 7 of the past 10 years. It's becoming a very frequent situation. As some of you know, Mongolia is primarily a rural country. It relies on herding of animals, and they're nomadic herders. That's their main source of revenue. Well, that extreme cold of -50 with wind chill and stuff has actually killed off millions of the animals that are herded every year there. So you have, again, I'm a health person. We talk about health and security issues. So we have veterinarian, veterinarian concerns. So large-scale animal death. Then you have the impact of that death on the humans who are the traditional herders. So their economic base now has plummeted over these years. Now you have a lot of them becoming environmentally displaced migrants, refugees, migrants within their own country. Many of them are now moving into Ulaanbaatar, the capital, living around in semi-urban, poverty areas around the capital. Their entire traditional structure of society is changing. A lot of the animal death, loss of the humans in these remote areas in Mongolia. You might think, well, that's certainly unfortunate for our ally and terrible. We do actually, again, have our military folks are involved helping them. But who surrounds Mongolia? What are the countries that surround Mongolia? Exactly, and you all know because you're geographers. Good job. It's like, you guys know, yeah, exactly. These are countries that we, view as competitors, if not adversaries, right there. And Mongolia, environmentally, geographically, has a lot of mineral wealth. It's a very valuable country now with rare earth minerals and other things like that. So you have this increased geopolitical interest from competitors and adversaries looking at it. So you can see how these things, like Nick was saying, Matt was talking about, these issues are connected. And we try to get our folks to understand how very tied in they are, and they have to be looked at from a system standpoint. One thing changes, it impacts 100 others. And they've got to really be looking at them from the big picture level. They can't be siloed. They've got to understand them from a very high level, and they have to look out years in terms of the changes that we're seeing and what to plan for and what to expect. So it's a really fascinating field to get into. I do a lot of lecture, and a lot of you are teacher, high school kids. I often lecture I asked to do guest lectures for high school kids, high school students, college students. And they are sometimes students that actually do want to get involved in national security as a career. They may not want to enlist in the military, enlist in the service, but they want to help. They actually get really fascinated by these kinds of topics. And again, because it's so multidisciplinary, there's a lot of room for young people to get involved in this area in careers in national security, even if you're not directly with the Department of Defense or the military.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Okay, let's open up the floor for questions.
Excellent panel. Thank you so much. So in geography, I often think, there's kind of good geography and bad geography. In my mind, good geography recognizes that time is also a first-class citizen, right? Not just space, it's time. In the military, we often talk kind of tactical, operational, strategic, where tactical is short periods of time. I feel like it's almost like we just assume kind of time spreads out differently in those three layers. That's not necessarily true, right? Strategic things can go down super fast. Tactical things can drag out over a long period of time. And when you model these things, or when you think about these things, how do you, like the human change and the environmental change unfolds at these different time scales. So how do you think about time scales? How do you think about how things unfold geospatially at a local level or a global level with time? And how does that integrate into decision making, right? Because you're a general, right? You're like, I have to deal with a bunch of these generals all the time, and they're drawn to the emergency, right? I mean, it's always like the important things over or the emergency is more important than the important things in a way. So I don't know. I don't even know if that's a question, but I just kind of wanted you guys to talk about time a little bit and how that unfolds over space.
Love that question. I'm sure you two will respond, but it's thank you for bringing it up. It's an issue that I struggle with as well, because you're right, in a lot of typical military situations, and not just in the U.S., other parts of the world as well, they may be looking out, long range, maybe 2 years from now, maybe 5 years from now. A lot of these environmental issues that they're playing out over a 10-year, 20-year, 50-year, even 100-year, 200-year period. And I think when we look at an environmental security standpoint, and we do look at the way that different nations and military groups look at time and how they use that to their advantage or detriment, the countries that are able to understand that these changes are taking place, they're complex, and they're happening over time. And if you understand that time scale, that can work to your benefit because you can identify different areas of the world that are experiencing different issues, things you need to be aware of. How do you take advantage of that? How can your adversary use that against you, for instance? But it's a real, you're absolutely correct, it's a real shift for senior military leaders sometimes who, often because of budgeting issues, they're going to be lucky to, be able to think about it 2 to 5 years out, not 50 to 100 years. So we really have to be thinking more strategically and being able to act upon these. It's a challenge. I would agree with everything you said. It's not there yet, and we've got to get people thinking about that. That's one of the things we do with our senior leaders in this program, try to get them to understand things decades out, and play the game of go.
Yeah, I love the question too, and
Yeah, it's good.
it's, as you implied, it's a big bureaucratic problem. Matt mentioned that a lot of decision makers, senior flag officers, don't have a ton of time to dive into nuanced modeling. That they don't want to look behind the curtain. They don't have time to look behind the curtain. They want answers. Best answer you got right now. That's some of my experience in briefing flag officers. From a modeling perspective, I think I mentioned this earlier, our goal is to provide a lot of flexibility in the modeling, to be able to, I don't know, from like an intuitive standpoint, like visual standpoint, I'm thinking the ability to kind of like zoom in on a problem. If you have some sort of conception of how motives around environmental stresses or the failure of governance leads to collective actions, like mobilization of different groups, you can kind of zoom in and out across different spatial and temporal dimensions to kind of get at what you might want as a civil affairs officer that's being deployed into the field. They might want more tactical level, near-term intervention options. But can they also understand the bigger picture where you allow that sort of flexibility in the modeling to kind of bubble up that analysis to a more strategic level, longer term, 5 years, something that would inform maybe the TSOC strategy, what's determining the deployment options for those teams of civil affairs officers. It's this. It kind of goes back to my original comments about like who you're talking to defines those spatial and temporal scopes, dimensions. But ideally, you'd have tools that would allow you to kind of go up and down those ladders of extraction or levels of analysis. It's hard, and it's, again, very parochial in some senses too. People want to focus on near-term tactical things and eschew everything else. Some people want to focus on strategic level things, and longer term, a lot of the budgeting people will want these sort of like mid-range time horizons. Technically, future operational environment in the Army is supposed to be looking out to 2040. They often got pulled back into the near term just because of bureaucratic realities and the tyranny of the present, all that. So it is like I said, I think it's a wonderful question because it's both of those, a bureaucratic problem, administrative problem, and a scientific modeling problem.
And it's interesting too, because yeah, you reminded me, Nick, something we're doing too now, a lot of these professional military institutions, they rely a lot on what's called wargaming to help senior leaders think strategically. There have now been more war games that are being developed in the environmental security realm, and you know, when you play the turns on them, it's not a game that necessarily takes place right now, but it's a strategic longer range game, can take place over decades, and each turn may represent 5 to 10 years. And what you decide, what you play right now, and what you decide today does impact the outcome in the future turns. So that's how they're trying, just one small example of how they're trying to modify some of their training and education to get to these issues that Nick was talking about. Yeah, it's a great question.
Matt, anything to add to
Yeah.
that, or we can take another question perhaps?
Just the last little bit on time. There's a couple, I don't know, counter themes that are running here because it's never been more difficult to think about the long-term future because there's so much sort of near-term distraction and activity and volatility that's happening right now, and a lot of our technologies are gained toward very short attention spans and further eroding those attention spans. So I think a lot of the gain is the model certainly, but also what's between your ears is the weapon of choice here. And there's communities like the Strategic Foresight community, of which Nick is a prominent member in producing very useful products to help us there look out into the future. But also there's organizations like the Long Now Foundation that are actively working on expanding those time horizons and sort of embedding that as a countercultural flow there that I think is useful space to watch. And if you get a chance, listen to some of their lecture series coming out of San Francisco. It's an important foundation, very small but interesting. And one of the recent lectures, they talked about this other piece that I want to mention, which is storytelling is the most powerful technology we've ever developed. And that really lends itself to coupling long-term futures or futures thinking with storytelling. And you're able to generate these scenarios which you can plan against. And when it's a compelling narrative, it's that much more useful to get after.
Okay, quick question.
I will try. Are any of you guys looking at future environmental changes and how it may affect troop deployment in the future?
Troop deployment.
I'm not
I couldn't
sure
hear
I
the
heard.
end of that.
Could you repeat the last bit?
We weren't able to
troop
hear that.
deployment.
How does
Okay.
it impact?
Can you
Troop
hear me now?
deployment? Yeah.
How do you think, are you guys studying how future environmental changes will affect troop deployments in the future?
Anyone?
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
So I can
Matt.
speak to that. So we are certainly, as far as the U.S. military logistics I mentioned, and deployment readiness, that's all bundled in there. There's some obvious things like just the physics of moving material from here to there, what's interfering with that, what could be problematic. There's also sort of a readiness issue in terms of force health. So if you think about malarial zones changing with changing weather patterns, something you want to watch is the force that's being projected there going to need inoculations for that before they arrive on site or take their malarial meds, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of considerations and thinking going into that. What's encouraging is that our partners are feeling that more acutely, but also more interested in getting after it. And so that's affecting their requests for support. You know, if they're looking at trucks, boats, whatever, are they designing for the right scenarios to get the job done that they need to get done? but also recognizing that many of their missions are starting to shift where they're getting into, just like the U.S. military, more and more disaster response and supporting civilian authorities. And so that's a different tool set and a different skill set. And so we're trying to support that evolution as well.
Protective textiles for warfighters, training schedules. How do you train in extreme heat, extreme humidity now, extreme cold? Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for listening to us, and thanks to our panelists for some great discussion, and we look forward to carrying on the conversation through the day today. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.